In 1848, a wave of revolution spread across Europe, with the home of the creator of the Holy Alliance being no exception. With large minorities, the spread of nationalism threatened to tear the empire apart. In order to appease the most numerous of these minorities, during April, Emperor Ferdinand agreed to Hungarian constitutional reforms while he cracked down on other minorities. It seemed like the tension was winding down and these constitutional changes would remain in place. A parliament and government of elected representatives convened in June and began acting as the lawful authority with the emperor's consent, and had already begun implementing reforms such as freeing the serfs. Most of the Hungarian demands were popular among other minorities in the region, with the notable exception of two. One was the dissolution of the Bologard region and its union with Hungary, which angered the populace of such regions who were ethnically non-Hungarians and until that point enjoyed considerable privileges from Bologard service. The other was union with Transylvania, which was opposed by ethnic Germans and Romanians in the region, who would be greatly outnumbered in parliament in case of such a union. This sparked counter-revolutions across Hungary, most notably Croatian, Serbian and Romanian opposition, who were the most motivated and numerous. At first, the Austrian authorities assisted the Hungarians in putting these rebellions down, but they soon realized this was their chance to reinstate their power. In September, the Ban of Croatia, Count Josip Jelačić, emboldened by arms and support received from Vienna, crossed the Hungarian border. This army was defeated in the first major engagement of the conflict, but due to some captured letters, it became clear that the government in Vienna doesn't support the new constitution. After this revelation, most of the Hungarian government resigned, with only a clique of more radical politicians remaining. The revolutionary administration in Transylvania was not very well established. They were tasked with the creation of 4 battalions of regular infantry, but due to a lack of volunteers, they only managed to create 2, the 11th and the 12th Honved battalions, which were equipped from imperial depots, mainly the armory in Karlsburg. These formations would constitute the backbone of the revolutionary forces. Furthermore, most Hungarian towns raised a national guard which were numerous in number but not very well equipped. To fill the ranks of more new formations, the revolutionary government began an aggressive campaign of conscription in many Romanian majority areas. This greatly radicalized the Romanian population, who began calling for armed resistance against such actions. This resulted in many large riots, which were stomped out by the authorities. This further fanned the flames of opposition. Buchner, still nominally in charge of Transylvania, weighed his odds. The troops under his command were of low quality, under strength, and commanded by old officers, sent here for a cozy retirement. He reorganized the imperial forces in the region, filling the ranks and organizing semi-permanent brigades, which could operate independently in the large region. This came at the cost of further dilution of quality in the ranks, which would play an important part in the coming campaign. Furthermore, this emptied the waning weapon reserves, not leaving much to be given to the allies. On October the 20th, Buchner openly stepped up against the revolutionaries. This divided the secular border guard units, who were unsure about who to support. However, almost all formations turned against Buchner, except 2 squadrons of the 11th Hussars, who would stay loyal until the end. Buchner thrust north with his troops, separating the revolutionaries. The northern group managed to escape under Tetz, while the southern, led by Sombori, enjoyed some modest successes, but was ultimately defeated in Marosvásárhely. This left the troops shattered, and all secular seats, with the exception of Háromszék, gave up the fight. The imperial forces could consolidate their position and solidify their control over the region. After the defeat of the combined secular army, the fate of Transylvania seemed to be decided. Mieczowski, governor of Bukovina, even sent a notable number of his men to assist Buchner's northern troops. Hungarian High Command believed that 50,000 men were needed to retake it, but that number was not achievable at this point. A few battalions and squadrons were sent to reinforce the northern formations under Tetz, deployed along the strategic passes with a knowledge of the Austrians. Most importantly, however, a new commander was sent to oversee the operation, Józef Bem, a Polish nobleman and veteran of the November uprising. he believed the Austrian troops facing him were hopelessly overstretched, so he decided to make his move. On the 20th of December, the offensive commenced. At the beginning of the winter campaign season, the balance of forces were as follows. The main Hungarian army was deployed in 3 brigades, each deployed on a highway to Klausenburg. Jaume's brigade near Kisnyeresz, Tetz's brigade around Breden-Zila, temporarily supplemented by a few thousand National Guardsmen from Krosno, and Ritschko's brigade around Chucha. Facing them were 3 Austrian brigades of smaller size. These brigades were not in close contact, as their operations were believed to only be that of mopping up remaining resistance. 2 of these brigades, however, were close to each other, facing Ritschko's command, the smallest of the Hungarian formations. Jablonski's brigade near Somkut, Urban's brigade near Nyírs, and Wardener's brigade near Bánffyhunyad. In the south, however, the balance of power was much different. The only revolutionary force was the Háromszék brigade under Sombor. Almost half the brigade's infantry was composed of armed peasants with little to no training and with inadequate equipment. They did, however, attain guns, as a former artillery corporal by the name of Gábor Áron invented a new way of making guns and ammunition, not requiring the complex machinery they lacked. This brigade was initially only faced by Gedeon's brigade in Kronstadt, which was the highest quality formation under Puchner's command. According to Puchner's plans, he would be reinforced by the other 2 brigades in the south, Kalényi's brigade in Hermannstadt and Lőzeny's brigade in Karlsberg. Not committed to any front remained Avramiancu and his large host of ill-equipped and trained volunteers in the Auraria Gemina mountains, waiting for an opportunity to show their worth. Most of the Hungarian army marched forth without any opposition. Ritschko marched towards suspected Austrian positions in Bánffyhunyad, while Urban marched towards suspected Hungarian positions in Chucha, and Wardener stayed in Bánffyhunyad, which meant that Ritschko was surrounded from 3 sides and didn't know the number of troops he was facing. Furthermore, Wardener contacted the local Romanian militia requesting their assistance. Avram sent a force of about 1,200 fighters to reconnoiter the situation in Klausenburg and received a letter informing him of the intentions of the closest Austrian brigade. On the 22nd, Urban and Wardener made their move against Ritschko in the early morning near Sebesvárolya. Urban's brigade was deployed in Chucha, while Wardener's was encamped near Bánffyhunyad, and Ritschko's was quartered in Sebesvárolya. Ritschko deployed his forces during the previous day to give advance warning of Austrian movements from either side. As the sun came up, first contact was made between National Guard units in the inn and surrounding woods, reporting back to Ritschko immediately. Wardener moved decisively to make a frontal attack, but as the situation became clearer, he elected to outflank the Hungarians from the south, expecting Urban's troops to arrive at any time. An artillery duel developed, which turned out very indecisive. Urban's force arrived on the field at 7:30, engaging the now rear guard of Ritschko, who began his retreat southward. Wardener's flanking force was matched by the 55th Honvéd, holding sparsely wooded heights above the stream, who were shortly thereafter reinforced by National Guard units. Ritschko's retreat was well executed, but even then, the haste meant that most of the wounded from the last half hour of fighting were left behind so that the formation could escape. Ritschko continued his retreat southwards, towards the mountains, and by a grueling forced march managed to escape the pursuit. However, his men were tired, demoralized, and most of the wounded they managed to carry away died due to the cold. The promised 4,000 Romanian militiamen arrived at the camp of Wardener not long after the battle. In the meanwhile, Zet advanced on towards Klausenburg, and thanks to an amicable populace and Austrian deployment, passed through the hills north of the city, unnoticed. As this was happening on the right flank of the northern Austrian position, 5 companies of light infantry from Jablonski's brigade arrived in Décs and began constructing defences on the southern bank. Jaume's brigade arrived north of Décs after a brief skirmish with Jablonski's dragoons, and they prepared to storm the bridge the next day. Jablonski's light infantry occupied the town facing the town's bridge. Their objective was to hold the crossing until the main body of the brigade arrived. Bam sent forwards the National Guards and volunteers, supported by a battery of guns, to begin skirmishing with the Grenzers defending the town. The Grenzers, as they saw the enemy columns charge for the bridge, retreated to their well-prepared positions in town to receive the charge. The troops were engaged in close-quarters combat upon the newly erected barricades. The Viennese Legion particularly distinguished itself, being experienced in this sort of fighting. The Grenzers were broken and forced from their position, but were able to set the town on fire to cover their retreat. The Hungarians worked to put out the fire to secure the bridgehead and began moving over the rest of the brigade. As the fighting was bloody, the Grenzers weren't pursued and were able to reform as Jablonski himself arrived on the field. The Grenzers settled into new positions to mask their inferiority in numbers and hold off Bam's forces until the rest of the brigade arrived. After 2 hours of forced marching, the remaining 2 battalions of the brigade arrived, but didn't occupy the high ground. The Hungarians put out the fire and began to form up for a new attack on the Austrian positions, sending out 2 squadrons of hussars as a distraction. The Grenzers were forced from the road after a short fight, and the rest of the heights fell to the men of the Viennese Legion. Bam extended his line to occupy the high ground. At the same time, the Austrians attempted to take it, which led to a very short and decisive close-range exchange of musketry, with both sides exhausted. The Austrians broke first, failing in their uphill attack, and the brigade was completely shattered in a matter of minutes. With Jablonski's brigade shattered, it was only able to retain its last semblance of cohesion due to a heroic rearguard action mounted by 4 infantry companies and a squadron of dragoons. Meanwhile, in the south, the Austrian forces began marching for Kronstadt. Buchner rode ahead to get there as fast as possible. Chambry reunited his command and cut off all major roads towards the town. Gedern mashed some of Chambry's cavalry screen but didn't initiate any action. Gedern withdrew his cavalry, facing their Hungarian counterparts, and sent them south to cover the only remaining main road leading out of the city. Chambry was unable to pursue this cavalry due to a snowstorm setting in. Von Buchner almost got captured this day, but was saved by a brave junior officer and managed to slip his pursuers thanks to the setting blizzard. Most of his staff escaped unscathed. Most of the Austrian column was halted to hold out for the blizzard that just reached them, which only began to dissipate around Kronstadt during the night. On the next day, the snowstorm reached Losanau, which forced him to settle down for the day. The same snowstorm, however, subsided by the afternoon at Kalenya's position, so his brigade marched a few kilometers until dusk. Chambry closed in on Kronstadt, and Gedern kept up his cavalry screen, assured that the southern approaches were safe. In the north, Urban and Wardener continued their pursuit, but as they were not informed of Tetz's brigade's presence, they didn't rush for Klausenburg, following Ritzko in the hopes of pinning him against the town's garrison. Ritzko continued his panicked retreat, while the Romanian populace refused to aid him and led the Austrian pursuers towards him. His way to safety was blocked by Avram's men sent to reconnoiter the area, and he was forced to halt. After sunset, his troops made contact with Tetz's main force, which was ready to take Klausenburg by the next day. The city was surrounded, and the messenger sent by the garrison was cut down by the screening hussars. The garrison commander elected to abandon the medieval town, as it would be impossible to hold against such odds, and prepared the small earthen citadel for a siege in the little time he had. On the 24th, Tetz occupied Klausenburg with no resistance, with the exception of the citadel, which he surrounded in preparation for a siege. Ritzko arrived there later in the day, with Urban and Wardener trailing him a few kilometers behind with the help of the locals. Wardener and Urban met up with the men sent by Avram and learned of his existence. The next day, Bam ordered a Christmas feast to be held, along with a shorter marching period, which gave enough time for Jablonski to avoid being pressed against the walls of Klausenburg. Tetz and Ritzko secured the encirclement of the citadel with a strong concentration of troops on the hill. Urban and Wardener maneuvered to the southern side of Klausenburg and finally made contact with Jablonski. Germany's brigade marched out of Apahida, expecting an easy march to Klausenburg, while Zetz prepared to take the citadel by assault. At 8, Zetz, after about an hour of preparation, sent ahead 2 battalions of infantry to storm the walls. He personally commanded the battalions in the assault, and after being forced off 2 times, the gates were broken down and the troops flooded in. The battalion defending the citadel surrendered, with only a few stragglers escaping to tell the Austrian forces in the area about what happened. After the citadel's capture, Ritzko's relatively fresh brigade was dispatched to link up with Germany's brigade in the east. After Desch, Bem only expected an understrength brigade to be in his way towards Klausenburg, which he knew was captured by Zetz. After encountering troops holding Samoschwalbe, he elected to cross the Samosch River to destroy Jablonski's supposedly isolated brigade. However, in reality, all 3 of the northern Austrian brigades were marching towards his position. After both sides deployed facing each other, the Hungarians advanced on Jablonski's position and managed to break his formation. By this time though, the 2 other brigades were already in the process of deploying. Wagner ordered a counterattack which broke the Schandau regiment. At this time, Bem realized what was happening and began to withdraw. Sensing victory, Wagner ordered a general advance. Bem managed to slip away with the help of local superiority in cavalry. After the battle, the 2 Hungarian brigades united east of Klausenburg and marched back into the town together. The Austrians quartered in Villach and were unable to capitalize on their previous victories due to a snowstorm arriving in the north. Meanwhile in the south, Kalyani's brigade made contact with the 11th Hussars of Chambéry, forcing the vedettes back to Wlodin. On the 26th, Kalyani's cavalry breached Chambéry's cavalry screen and linked up with Gadeon. His main column halted in Zieden, and the southern generals convened in Kronstadt. Lausonii resumed his advance as the storm passed. The following day, Kalyani's brigade marched into Kronstadt itself with a few miles march. Chambéry moved the bulk of his force to Zieden to block off the Austrian line of communication. On the 28th, the Austrian commanders agreed to clear their lines of communication. They marched out with both brigades to the west. Chambéry's cavalry delayed them as his main force hastily made for Wiedenbach to hold the Austrians off on favourable ground. The battle was inconclusive and slow due to half a meter of snow still persisting from the blizzard. After a short artillery duel, the Sackler brigade managed to retreat in good order without too many casualties, but the Austrian line of communication was reopened. Chambéry retreated towards his previous positions near Hedwig, as the Austrians, content with their victory, only gave pursuit with their cavalry. In the northern theatre, the Hungarians sallied out of Klausenburg to attack a perceived isolated brigade. This unit turned out to be a large band of Romanian militiamen. As it had moved north to spread the men among more villages, however, it was intercepted by this force and elected to retreat, calling for reinforcements. The Austrian main force was cut off from the allied Romanians in Samoschwalbe, and due to the superior numbers of Hungarian cavalry, Wagner, overall commander of the brigades, was unable to assess enemy strength and intentions correctly and gave battle. The sides deployed against each other, with Ritzko not present as he was dealing with the Romanian irregulars in Samoschwalbe. After an hour-long artillery bombardment, the Austrians made their attack with 2 brigades, uphill in knee-deep snow. The attack went rather well, however the attacks were not well coordinated and the attack in the center was delayed by the snow and the steep slope. The attack of the Austrian right was repulsed, and when the central assault began, Ritzko's troops began arriving en masse. The central assault was decisively repulsed by canister fire from 2 batteries, and 5 squadrons of hussars were sent forward to charge down the shattered Austrian line, but were severely hindered by the snow. So Wagner's 3 squadrons of cavalry and 2 companies of grenadiers, personally taken under his command, managed to hold the hussars. The centre was broken and a large traffic jam developed on the single small road leading back towards Villach. However, the Hungarian troops were also tired, and together with the snow the infantry was unable to catch up. The cavalry regrouped after their charge and attempted to pursue the fleeing loyalists. The retreat of the army was screened by the Romanians from Sasvanish, who thwarted the hussars' pursuit in the woods. the three Austrian brigades retreated to Torda, a major crossroad and one of the only bridges on the Aranyos River. They intended to reorganize in the time after gaining a day's march on their adversaries. During the day, a member of Tord Gyula's staff found the sought-after detailed maps they had been lacking and began copying them. On the 29th, the Hungarian forces, after reorganizing, began their march along the suspected enemy line of retreat, leaving Klausenburg with no garrison, only the army's quartermaster, tasked with copying the maps. They broke the resistance of the Romanian militiamen in the woods, scattering them. Most of the survivors joined local resistance groups, but some continued on to link back up with their loyalist comrades. A few hours later, the Hungarian vanguard made contact with a thin screen of Chevaliers west of Torda. The Austrians attempted to make contact with their Romanian allies, but due to the quick Hungarian advance, these attempts didn't succeed. The Hungarian main force under Bem, after believing the Austrians could easily be cut off from the crossing, commenced an attack on the Tyne. However, his reports were incomplete, and the bulk of the Austrian forces were actually inside the Tyne, preparing and waiting. Thus commenced the bloodiest battle in the entire campaign. Bem deployed 4 batteries of guns to soften the Austrian positions in the Tyne and began the bombardment at 9:30. 2 brigades were ordered forth to storm the Tyne. Urban's 2 half batteries attempted to suppress the Grand Battery but were targeted and shot to pieces. Urban's Grenzers rushed to take the western buildings to fend off the attack. Kamen's CK volunteers marched through the vineyards, blundering into strong resistance and righted on the spot. The main attack, however, went through and dislodged the Grenzers. Britsko's Humveds swung around both flanks of the main attack and began rolling up the Grenzers' positions, capturing a half battery in the process. A charge was made by Urban's dragoons, but the infantry retreated into the safety of the vine-rows, giving time for a battery of guns to be turned and forced to retreat. The fighting moved inside the Tyne, and the brutal close-range fire wore down both sides, neither willing to give ground. The Austrians recognized what was happening and pulled Wardener's brigade into the Tyne to reinforce the crumbling line. The first line was broken after the Hungarians turned the captured guns to fire canister into the packed streets. The 31st Honved was ordered to charge, threatening to sweep away the centre, but was checked by fresh reinforcements and what remained of Urban's artillery. Wardener attempted a cavalry charge into the Tyne, which failed miserably, incurring many losses. The Hungarians attempted to circumvent the Austrian positions with cavalry, however they were forced off by 2 companies of Grenzers, saving the entire Austrian baggage train and the last battery of guns. Bem ordered 6 squadrons of hussars to make a wide outflanking maneuver towards the salt mines. Wardener ordered an attack, but it was repulsed after a short firefight. The Austrians retreated and the Hungarians counterattacked through the cemetery and surrounding streets. Bem committed a general attack and Urban's last battery was overrun, as the Austrians organized a proper retreat. A combined rearguard of about 2 battalions strength was left behind under Jablonski to delay the Hungarians as long as he could, to facilitate a proper withdrawal. The rearguard was routed with heavy losses, but held back the Tyne long enough that the rest of the formation could retreat unmolested. For his efforts, Jablonski was mortally wounded and died almost immediately. After the engagement's conclusion, the Austrians retreated southwards towards Karlsburg. Along the way, von Wardener fell from his horse, dying instantly from the fall. His chief of staff mounted an attempt to recover the body, but slipped on the icy ground himself and fell to his death. The Austrian forces lost a terrifying amount of men, their popular, charismatic leader, and were forced to retreat. The morale, however, seemed to be amicable, as the troops believed they had inflicted a lot more casualties than they had suffered. As we now know, they were absolutely right. As the Hungarians settled into Torda, they sent the prisoners escorted by 2 squadrons of cavalry and 4 companies of National Guard back to Klausenburg to be handled. Todt received them while he personally oversaw the copying of the maps and paroled all the prisoners 2 days later. Unknown to him, most of the Romanian militia and regulars he paroled joined local or regional resistance groups. Also, around this time, the 27th Honved, the first Hungarian reinforcements, arrived and passed through Klausenburg. As this was happening, much changed on the southern flank. On the 29th, Austrian commanders in Kronstadt began a pursuit with both brigades in the direction of Heathfield. The Secular Brigade began their retreat almost immediately as contact was made. They retreated east, linking up with the 3rd Battalion of the 15th Secular. The next day, the Austrians resumed their march, but as they were crossing the woods west of Iafalva, they encountered Hungarian hussars. The Jaegers were ordered up to dislodge them from the road, and the advance continued. The hussars, however, bought just enough time for the Seculars to deploy, as Schomberg wished to attack the Austrians to deny them the initiative. Kalyani began deploying his forces on the hill overlooking the field while the Secular force was already drawn up. Gadon's brigade was moved to outflank the Secular positions through the woods and set up a line facing a dried up creek bed and some thick bushes. As the Austrians appeared to be passive, Schomberg ordered the Secular regulars to make a bayonet charge towards a presumed open flank against the wishes of his second in command. The border battalions closed up their ranks and marched ahead. They crossed a deep riverbed, then pushed through some thickets on the far side. When they appeared on the other side though, they find a battalion of grenadiers squaring off against them and another battalion on their flank. They froze in place, leaving both sides flustered. The grenadiers were reluctant to open fire on their old comrades, still in their imperial uniforms, and the Seculars likewise. After a few seconds of this, one of the inexperienced recruits fired their rifle in panic, which was followed by a disjointed discharge from their battalion, followed by an orderly volley by the grenadiers at 30 paces. The Seculars were completely taken by surprise and barely managed to fire a few shots before their formation completely disintegrated, leaving only a pink line in the snow. Both battalions were decimated and set to flight in a matter of seconds. As Schomberg saw his men fleeing in terror, he lightly exclaimed, "Esther." This maneuver neutered Schomberg's brigade, as 70% of his regulars were now fleeing and done with the fighting for the day. He sounded a general retreat, which was followed by Kalyani's general advance. Schomberg made the hard decision and sent in the poorly armed volunteers to make a sacrificial charge against the pursuing infantry, to buy enough time to retreat. This attack was checked by Austrian regulars and surrounded by cavalry. Their action, however, allowed the rest of the brigade to escape. After the battle, Schomberg withdrew with the remnants of his brigade, covered by his cavalry. After reaching Shepsy-Sendjord, one of the new cannon foundries, Gall, the quartermaster of the Secular army, began preparations to relocate the manufacturing equipment and already prepared gun barrels. The Austrian advance threw a wrench into the newly built-out Secular supply system. The victorious Austrian brigades made contact with Lozenau's brigade soon after, finally uniting. The next day, Schomberg, after the losses of Iafalva, decided to withdraw his brigade northward and gave up on protecting the regional capital Kérdivásárhely, only shadowing the Austrian force. The main Austrian force, united and under von Puchner, started marching for Háromszék's capital to put the renegade province back in order. On the retreat, Schomberg changed course to march west, but his planned quarters turned out to be a glass-blowing workshop and not much else, leaving most of his men to sleep outside. He also recalled his cavalry and left Kérdivásárhely to its fate. The Austrians took a rest day to celebrate the new year and raise morale. They also received a dispatch informing them of the fall of Klausenburg, which hastened their moves. Gall, the Secular's quartermaster, only on the 2nd sent out a rushed dispatch to the finery and ammunition manufacturer in Kérdivásárhely to evacuate immediately. The message was only received a few hours before the Austrians arrived, so the evacuation was hasty, incomplete, leading to a large portion of the equipment being destroyed. The Austrians reached Kérdivásárhely within a few hours and marched past it, expecting enemy resistance along the way, but other than the National Guard cavalry shadowing them, no such resistance materialized. The Austrians released the volunteer peasants captured at Iafalva, with some light beating here and there, as a show of goodwill to the locals. Schomberg sent out his hussars to shadow the Austrians and reconnoiter the area in Kronstadt. The Austrian forces, seeing no further resistance, returned to Kérdivásárhely and began pacifying the region, leaving Gedon's brigade to hold the mountain passes to the north. thousands of locals from the southern part of the Siege began gathering to oppose the Austrian incursion. On the 4th, Gedeon's brigade returned to Kezdivásárhely and joined the pacifying efforts, and the Austrians received a delegation which wished to surrender the Siege. On the 5th, the Austrians expanded their control of the region, pacifying the northern part of the Siege completely. A treaty was signed, giving general amnesty to all except the leaders who went into hiding rather than surrendering, and word began to spread among the locals. The Sackler's commanders were not aware of these events, with Chambéry and Drochner meeting only on that day for the first time in Tushnad. Drochner, up to this point, was at work rallying his home region of Csíkszék to rejoin the fight against the Loyalists. On the 21st, he sent out his National Guard cavalry to assess the situation and gather volunteers and supplies. He also requested Csíkszék's executive committee to assemble and received a favorable answer. A few days later, he met with the committee, and the body agreed to gather the 1st Sackler Grand Regiment in defense of the Siege. He also began large recruiting efforts for volunteers, although he did not have anything to arm them with. On the 27th, the 1st Sackler began gathering at their battalion headquarters. On the 30th, Drochner handed out the uniforms remaining in the 1st Sackler Regiment's depot to his volunteer troops. He later sent out most of the 1st Sackler to fortify the southern approaches to Csíkszereda and sent his National Guard cavalry to Kezdivásárhely to get more information on the situation. He did this without knowledge or permission of the committee. During the evacuation of the manufacturing equipment from Kezdivásárhely, the National Guard cavalry played a vital role in distracting and delaying their regular counterparts. He moved back towards Kezdivásárhely to his cavalry to see the situation for himself and encountered a strong cavalry screen. Then he rode back towards Csíkszereda with his cavalry, passing by a few patrols from Chambéry, but paying no mind to them. Drochner sent back his cavalry to keep an eye on the Austrian movements, and finally met up with Chambéry on the 5th. As all this unfolded, action resumed in the north. On the 1st, Urban took 2 squadrons of dragoons to reconnoiter enemy positions around Torda. The rest of his men, along with the 2 other brigades, moved to block the crossroad at Felvins and began to prepare the position to defend against an attack from the north. The remnants of the Romanian force who they fought alongside reached their position and joined them. The next day, Urban skirmished with some cavalry around Torda. A few days prior, Bem sent out an inordinate amount of pamphlets with the following text: I am Bem József, the Commander-in-Chief of the forces of the OHB. I have liberated Kolozsvár and I am driving the insidious Germans out of our beloved homeland. Aid me in this effort, the Austrians can threaten you no longer. Rise up, join your fatherland in the struggle. These pamphlets spread like wildfire around the region, and the word spread even further. This achieved its goal of rallying the Hungarians into action against the Loyalists, but it also galvanized the Romanian population, who gathered in ever larger numbers. The Hungarian army under Bem resumed their offensive, deciding to take a longer route in hopes of surprising the Austrians and cutting off the line of communication with Karlsburg. Rizko's brigade was left behind to keep the perceived brigade still near Torda occupied. This day, a dispatch sent by Mortulus to army headquarters was captured by a forward element of the 11th Hussars, but its contents just confused Bem even more. On the 4th, the Hungarians began their coordinated attack. Rizko moved out from Torda, and 2 brigades under Bem approached the Austrian positions from the southwest. But Bem's men were quickly spotted by Romanian militiamen, and the element of surprise was lost. The Austrians retreated to a position east of Felvins to counteract the flanking maneuver, and were reinforced by Urban's returning cavalry. But this allowed the Hungarian forces to unite. After their enemy's numerical superiority became apparent, the Austrians decided to give up their positions. To cover the retreat, the Austrians set fire to the town of Felvins. The Hungarian pursuit proved futile, and the Austrians managed to retreat to safety in good order. A squadron of hussars was sent south to reconnoiter the area of Karlsburg. These hussars were spotted by some of Avram's lookouts. Since the 21st, he came down from the mountains with the invitation of Lozanau, in hopes of arming his men, but was disappointed to find the depots empty of anything useful for him. He settled into the town with his men and began gathering volunteers and donations from sympathetic locals. After a few days of waiting, as the flow of volunteers began drying up, he divided his force into two formations: the Legion, composed of the best men, mostly veterans of the Romanian border regiments, armed with firearms. This group was about a battalion's worth of men, who began drilling with the help of the regulars left to garrison the fort. The rest formed the Auxilia, which was organized into bands. These accounted for the majority of Avram's forces, numbering around 4,500 men. When news came of the spotted Hussars, he was rather worried, as due to his lack of cavalry, he believed the main Hungarian army were coming for him, which his force, of course, couldn't hope to match. Thus he made preparations for a march east. On the 5th, Bem's orders were received to move out from Klausenburg, and the 15th Hussars headed back to the main column. The northern Austrian brigades elected to split up in their retreat, Motulus and Ostowitz going east then south, while Urban decided to move west first. Bem continued the pursuit, now in full force, which meant that Urban's brigade was completely isolated. The Hungarian cavalry, however, received orders which split its force, and this was enough for the well-trained Grenzinfanterie and Chevaliers to weather the attacks. They bore the enemy cavalry with distinction and managed to fight their way to friendly reinforcements before nightfall. The main Hungarian column was unable to catch up in time to destroy this element, which greatly frustrated Bem and his officers. Urban's men were spent in the affair, and the Austrian retreat had to be continued. The Romanian militia left the Austrian camp and joined the local rebels who went home. The battalion left to garrison Marosvásárhely earlier in the campaign, learned of the Hungarian forces in the vicinity, and began preparations on the town's castle, which would have important effects in the future. The following day, Urban marched out with his brigade ahead of time, which turned out to be a brilliant call, but this was not communicated to the other brigade commanders. The Hungarian vanguard skirmished with the Austrian rearguard, but after a botched ambush attempt by Austrian light infantry, the Hungarian hussars fell back. The forces under Bem marched out northeastwards to outflank the Austrian positions in Medias, leaving Zetz with his brigade to observe the Austrian movements. Zetz, however, didn't give the necessary orders for this to be the case, and failed to notice that the Austrians have already left the town. Not willing to risk an engagement, even in such an advantageous position, Urban marched far ahead of the column, so he stumbled upon Avram and his men marching the opposite direction. On the 8th, Zetz sent out his cavalry and found Medias deserted, so he immediately marched to pursue the enemy, but they were already far gone. He moved eastward and sent out a squadron to the south to find the enemy. However, by this point, the Austrian brigades reached Hermannstadt and began fortifying work almost immediately, expecting to be pursued. As all this was happening in the north, Droschner moved the bulk of his brigade near Tusnad in anticipation of marching on Kézdivásárhely, while Chambéry moved south with his men. Gedon sent out his cavalry to dislodge Droschner's cavalry to the north, which they greatly succeeded in, until reaching the Nyerges Pass, where their advance was checked. Droschner left with most of his brigade for Csíkszereda to hold his positions there, leaving only his National Guard cavalry behind to hold the Nyerges Pass, who were able to keep the position. After the news of the surrender arrived, Chambéry returned to Tusnad with his brigade to await further news for clarification and began pulling back his cavalry from their previous positions. The main Austrian army, leaving Gedon's cavalry behind to screen their rear, began their march back completely unimpeded, with only 2 squadrons of cavalry arriving to screen them in the afternoon. Droschner and Chambéry reunited along with all available troops. Gedon's cavalry was forced from its position by a battalion of infantry and fell back immediately towards Kézdivásárhely, shadowed by Droschner's National Guard cavalry. The circular forces marched for Kézdivásárhely. For Droschner, this meant moving outside of the siege borders, which Csíkszék's council has not permitted yet. Most of his troops followed him anyway, except the 2,000 volunteers, who stayed behind, refusing to defy the council. At this time, the Austrians passed through Kronstadt, leaving no garrison. As the main column moved on, Gedon's cavalry was cut off and forced into the town. the Sackler brigades reached Kézdivásárhely, where they were not met with the enthusiasm they expected, as most of the locals were content with the treaty. However, news of the Hungarian victories arrived by letter from Bem personally, which reinvigorated the revolutionary spirit in the locals, who chased away their collaborators and restored the revolutionary cabinet. Csíkség's council gave formal permission for Drosna to operate in the larger Transylvanian region, so the volunteers were sent to reinforce the other southern pass in case of possible loyalist incursion. The Sackler troops marched out with much fanfare and headed for Kronstadt. On the 11th, von Deutsch was replaced by Puchner's chief of staff, his son Hannibal von Puchner. Bem arrived in the southern theatre as his vanguard stumbled on Austrian pickets near Galatz, but they were soon reinforced by most of the Austrian cavalry, so the hussars were unable to force their will, while the loyalist cavalry was not assertive with their superiority. After the columns passed by, Bem's forces occupied Fogaras, except the castle, which remained in the hands of the local Saxon militia. A few hours before dawn on the 12th, Gedeon's cavalry snuck out of the walled town and managed to gallop by the Sackler formations, who were unable to get in their way, and the pursuit was unsuccessful. Gedeon's cavalry found themselves between two advancing forces, and elected to move off the road and head north. The formation managed to cross the frozen river at a small ford they found the day before. After they shook off their pursuers, they headed towards Hermannstadt. Shortly after a brief skirmish, the Hungarian cavalry met their Sackler counterparts for the first time in 3 months. On this day, earlier, Gal Sándor, the Sackler quartermaster, left the army to attend to the supply crisis caused by the rushed evacuation efforts. And at this point, both armies were mostly unified and concentrated. Avram found the Austrian force along the Hermannstadt-Kronstadt road, but communication remained limited. He has been very active during the days leading up to this encounter. After marching over and passing by the retreating brigades, he learned of Tzetz's return to Mediash and was almost found by him. But some local Romanian volunteers tipped Avram off to his presence, so the Romanian host was able to move off the road, using unmarked paths, guided by the locals to avoid Tzetz's hussars. He moved eastward, linking up with a large group of local Landsturm, who had been facing Tzetz's patrols for a while. Tzetz, wishing to do something about reported bands of Romanian peasants, marched out with his brigade to crush them, but unknowingly marched straight for Avram's command. After some short skirmishing, battle was given in the close vicinity of Berthelm. Avram occupied the high ground overlooking the town and sent a company's worth of men to hold the fortified church. Tzetz, suspecting a large force of Romanians to be inside the town, set it ablaze. Avram fell back behind the crest of the hill to lure in the enemy hussars. It worked, as the hussars took the bait almost immediately. While this was happening, the local Landsturm arrived and charged Tzetz's exposed positions inside the town. While the frontal assault was repulsed, a flanking charge took the gunners by surprise and swept the inexperienced National Guard aside. As Tzetz shifted over reinforcements, the militia retreated, dragging the guns and ammunition wagons behind them. Avram also retreated to better positions. Tzetz wasn't able to bring up his guns, as the only crossing where he could have brought over his guns was in the now burning town. Seeing as his opponents had properly deployed, Avram called a retreat and destroyed the captured guns and wagons. Avram's formation fell back in good order, and the Hungarian pursuit was unfruitful. The main Romanian force marched south, towards where they ended up on the 13th. All Austrian forces in the region, with the exception of a single battalion in Karlsberg, were now concentrated near Hermannstadt, and the Grand Council of War was held. Hannibal von Puchner, quartermaster of the Army of Transylvania, was sent to the main depot in Karlsberg to oversee operations in the area. After Bem's arrival, the defenders of Kronstadt saw it no longer worthwhile to hold the city, believing they would not be relieved, and agreed to the newly presented demands. After that, 4 brigades under direct command of Bem were now united. After Urban fell deathly ill with pneumonia, his formation was divided between the other brigades due to lack of senior officers. On this day, the Austrian army marched for Karlsberg, as they still expected the main Hungarian force to be headed that direction. and the revolutionaries under Bam's command marched out west to seize the other two major cities supporting the loyalists. Avram marched out northward to continue his operations in the Hungarian rear. Bam's column was opposed by Saxon militia from Fogaras, but it only caused a slight delay as they were forced into the castle at the center of Fogaras. There they surrendered after a short negotiation, seeing no chance of being relieved. After half a day's march, the main Austrian army turned about and countermarched towards Medias, and Segeshvar further east, at this time believing the main revolutionary forces to be in that area due to delayed information arriving about Berthelm and receiving confirmation that Karlsburg was safe. A snowstorm began in the greater Karlsburg region and drifted northeastward, but it had nowhere near the size nor the impact of the previous storm. Mausolus was sent back with his brigade to secure Karlsburg from any possible enemy thrusts, while the rest of the army continued its march towards the northeast. On the 18th, Mausolus reached Karlsburg and shortly conversed with the quartermaster. Bam's advanced force surrounded Hermannstadt, but not in time to trap Mausolus's dragoons, who escaped and alerted him to the situation. Seeing the town's strong defenses and the unknown number and strength of forces in sight, Bam elected to bypass the well-fortified positions. Expecting reinforcements very soon, the Hermannstadter militia refused multiple times to surrender. Bam elected to bypass Hermannstadt and marched on a force of unknown size found by cavalry patrols the previous day. The main Austrian army linked up with Avram, who informed them of the brigade operating in the area, which they planned to destroy. Mausolus, leaving about half his brigade in Karlsburg, marched out with great haste towards Hermannstadt to prevent its fall. He managed to force back a very large cavalry force and almost managed to destroy it in an ambush, but was ultimately unsuccessful in doing so. Hannibal von Puchner sent a dispatch to Puchner informing him of Hermannstadt's suspected fall. The next day, Mausolus continued his advance and arrived in Hermannstadt basically uncontested, and sent out his cavalry to pursue the enemy counterparts to the north. Shortly after linking up with Avram around Eberswalba, Puchner received Hannibal's letter and immediately ordered a countermarch together with the Romanians, which put him on a collision course with the main Hungarian army. This coming battle would decide the fate of the campaign. So let's see what happened in the side theatres leading up to it. Todt remained in Klausenburg. After paroling the prisoners, he received further reinforcements, 3 squadrons of the 15th, but they were ordered back just a few days later on the 5th. His staff was also able to finish copying the maps and send them after the Hussars the following day. On the 8th, he marched out with his entire force to confront a large group of Romanian volunteers and beat them decisively. He then moved back to Klausenburg and dispersed his troops in the area to project control and protect supply lines. On the 14th, the 32nd Honved and a squadron of the Kresgevalers, Italians, arrived in Klausenburg and joined the town's garrison. At this time, Todt began receiving letters from some local Hungarians about armed groups of Romanians in the locality. On the 17th, he sent out 2 groups to confront the Romanian militia bands he gained knowledge of. The northern group shadowed the band they were assigned to, while the southern, more numerous one made its attack and succeeded decisively. On the 18th, he unified his 2 formations and sent them to disperse the larger band, which they succeeded in decisively once again. All this fighting and the growing number and strength of resistance groups meant that communication would be hard and transporting supplies basically impossible. In the north, a more curious turn of events went down, as Avram and Tetz would face each other once again. After the previous encounter, Tetz went east expecting to link up with Ben there, but was distracted along the way. On the 15th, in Segeshvar, he received letters from a large group of armed Hungarian peasants wishing to destroy the loyalist garrison of Marosvásárhely. Tetz immediately marched out towards the city to take it, with the assistance of a group of armed locals about 2,000 strong. He soon arrived in Marosvásárhely, and in the last fleeting hours of the day, after a few hours' bombardment, the town's medieval walls gave way and breaches opened, which Tetz judged large enough to assault. A full-scale frontal assault was launched against the walls with ladders, and the volunteers charged into the breach. The defenders were overwhelmed and forced into the castle's large bastions, where they held out until after sunset. Tet denied quarters to the Grenders who attempted to surrender. Seeing the seriousness of the situation, a large group of Grenders escaped through an unguarded gate and managed to evade the Hungarian cavalry patrols. Most of the men in the battalion, however, stayed inside to give their comrades a chance to escape and stood their ground to the last man. Tet's hussars tracked down the escaped Grenders the following day and began an aggressive pursuit. However, the Grenders were saved by Avram's arrival, who scared off the enemy cavalry. Avram made an attempt to pull the reverse slope trick on the enemy cavalry once again, but this time his auxiliary proved not disciplined enough to follow through and got charged down, only regrouping in the woods. Tet's main force arrived on the field as the Romanians took defensive positions in the woods north of Hederfire. Tet sent forward his cavalry to screen his column, while he deployed facing suspected enemy positions. After some potshots, the hussars were scared off from the woods. He brought forward his guns, expecting to storm the forest, but seeing the enemy's full strength, Avram elected to retreat. This, however, meant crossing a large open slope, and the hussars seized the opportunity and charged down the disorganized auxiliary, inflicting heavy casualties. Most of the auxiliary just ran. Only a few groups managed to form small circular formations to fend off the cavalry. These formations were then picked off one by one, and no prisoners were taken. Only the legion and Grenders held their ground, saving whatever was left of the auxiliary. This time, with more open terrain, the Hungarian pursuit proved a lot more successful and inflicted further casualties into the right-wing Romanian host. Avram managed to conduct a successful rearguard action north of Ebesvalva, after which the enemy cavalry disengaged. These losses would be important for the coming battle. After seeing the events of the side theatres, let us now return to the final confrontation. Buchner's now lead elements bumped into Bem's advanced guard near Mediash, and after a short skirmish between the two sides' cavalry, a stalemate developed as both sides elected to hold off the planned attack until all their forces were present and ready. The Austrians sent one of their 5 available formations on a wide flanking maneuver, which had profound consequences on the following engagement, as it was effectively taken out of the equation. Both sides arranged a formation with 2 brigades in the front and 2 in the back. For the Austrians, however, one of these reserves was the recently bloodied host of Avram, which could not be expected to match regulars in a pitched battle. The battle began with a Hungarian general advance. Schomburg's brigade moved to seize the hill anchoring the Austrian left. However, Kalyani noticed the importance of the position and sent a battalion of his Grenders to secure it. The Hungarian advance was greatly hampered by the bottleneck of the creek crossing, which allowed the Austrian guns to inflict sizable losses onto the Hungarian gunners before they could bring all the batteries to bear. As the artillery duel developed, Buchner stayed to inspire his gunners, but was hit by a shell fragment and carried from the field mortally wounded. While all this was happening, Schomburg's troops broke the single battalion of Grenders sent their way, so Kalyani immediately ordered up more reserves and personally headed there to oversee the counterattack. His quick response managed to stabilize the front, but after the Austrian guns were decisively beaten, the center opened up for a potential attack, with the 11th Honved poised to exploit it. Bem ordered forward the left and center, causing Osterwitz's brigade to begin to crumble. In the woods, the fighting remained indecisive and bloody. Both brigades reached the verge of completely breaking. At this critical moment, Kalyani sent forth his volunteer Jägers. They surprised the last Hungarian battalion, which broke and ran almost immediately. Schomburg himself was seriously wounded, and even Bem got caught up in the mess as he was inspecting the positions. On the Austrian right, a counterattack headed by the Uraka Grenadiers managed to break most of Jurmai's brigade. As they gave pursuit, however, they were overstretched, disorganized, and presented an open flank. So Jurmai ordered a cavalry charge with all available squadrons. The cavalry charge, assisted by Droschner's assault, completely broke the will of the remaining Austrian units in the field, who began a disorganized raid. Amidst all the chaos, his grenadiers kept their cool and formed a battalion square, repulsing the charge of the 11th Hussars. The rest of the Austrian formation ran for the perceived safety of the Tyne's walls. The Grenadiers were cut off from the Tyne, forcing them to retreat northwards, so the only formation in fighting shape inside the walls was the 1st Battalion of the 41st Shevkovich Regiment. Bem ordered the Tyne to be cut off, which was executed swiftly, and the entire Austrian force was trapped inside, save for about a brigade's worth of fighting men who managed to leave through the eastern gate in time. Most of the Austrian high command was also trapped inside, along with Avram Yakub. As the walls were breached, most stayed behind to ensure the welfare of the men, and only sent out Gedon with a few trusted men to escape over the walls to bring the news of the disaster. By nightfall, most of the Austrian command surrendered, except the 41st Shevkovich, which held the Tyne's fortified church to the last man. Their sacrifice allowed for more men to escape and the news to spread. The majority of the loyalist army in the region became prisoners of war, and the army's command structure completely collapsed. During the following days, most of the escaped stragglers from the battle would be captured and Lausanne chased back to Hermannstadt, which would soon be under siege along with Karlsburg. These fortresses could hold for a month or two, but the long-awaited Russian intervention would not materialize under such conditions in time to relieve these strongpoints. However, what also needs to be mentioned is that the majority of Transylvania was at this time controlled by Romanian militias, which would need to be dealt with in order for the Hungarians to solidify their control over the region. Now that we went through the many happenings of that fateful winter, let us see the most notable personalities from this conflict. Josef Bem, Commander-in-Chief of the 6th Hungarian Corps, tasked with retaking Transylvania. He distinguished himself in the campaign, commanding most major engagements personally. His leadership was key to inspiring the Hungarian army after harsh defeats, and is viewed by most nowadays as a talented officer. Anton Puchner, Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Transylvania, tasked with defending the region from revolutionary incursions. His plan and leadership in its execution gave the revolutionaries quite the trouble. He managed to hold together his inexperienced command well enough to have had a fighting chance at final victory, if only he wasn't wounded at Midias. Sombor Sándor, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Secular Army. His conduct in delaying the main Austrian force was essential for the revolutionary forces to even have a chance of victory. Even though he made some mistakes, he is nowadays considered to be the most talented commander of the theatre. Avram Yakub, former lawyer, commander of the Auraria Gemina Volunteers, Prince of the Mountains. His organizational and campaigning efforts tied up an entire brigade of revolutionary regulars, while small auxiliary bands disrupted enemy communications. His success inspired many other Romanians to take up arms and fight for their freedom against the old oppressors. With his death at the hands of the hated Hungarians at Medias, he is considered a martyr of the Romanian cause and is widely celebrated as a national hero. Tóth Gyula was the quartermaster of 6th Corps. His efforts in organization were instrumental in the long-term securing of Transylvania for the revolutionary cause. His efforts in curbing radicalism among his ranks provided the opportunity for faster pacification of the region. He is, however, very controversial among Romanians as a figure closely associated with oppression. Julius von Teutsch, 1st Quartermaster of the Army of Transylvania. His conduct dropped off during the campaign, which led to his replacement by Hannibal von Puchner. Hannibal von Puchner was the 2nd Quartermaster of the Army of Transylvania. Much more successful than his predecessor, he was able to provide the support needed for the army to properly fight in the field, and personally oversaw the defense of the most important loyalist stronghold of Karlsburg. Gal Sándor was the quartermaster of the combined secular forces. His organizational skills kept the seculars in the field and their guns out of enemy hands for the entire duration of the campaign. His efforts in rebuilding the secular supply system were successful, so much so that the production of arms was at their old rate by early February. Ritschko Ignác Károly commanded the Right Brigade of the Hungarian 6th Corps. His reliable conduct, both on the field and on the march, under Bem and in independent command, helped his cause to victory. Zec János commanded the Center Brigade of the Hungarian 6th Corps. He cooperated well with Bem, but when he gained independent command, his deficiencies showed, giving unclear or inadequate orders on many occasions. His thirst for blood and knack for destruction of all things that he believed hostile makes him universally despised by Transylvania's Romanian population, forever remembering the murderer of Berthelm. He is rather unknown in Hungarian circles, as his conduct is not well known, and he was sacked not long after his infamous actions by Bem before the spring campaign would even begin. Zsurmai Lipót commanded the left brigade of the Hungarian Sixth Corps. During the campaign, he proved to be a reliable officer, always closely working with Bem, and had potential for independent command. His leadership was key to many of the early victories, as well as the final one of the campaign. His unusually large staff provided valuable work to Hungarian high command. Josef Grossner von Kalyani commanded the garrison of Hermannstadt in the army of Transylvania. He was the de facto commander of the three southern brigades and commanded them on the field in most engagements, including their final one. He distinguished himself in this role, reliably holding his own on both a tactical and strategic level. He personally faced Sombori in all major engagements of the campaign, personally beating him every time. Franz von Gedern commanded the garrison of Kronstadt in the army of Transylvania. As the commander of the most elite brigade in the army, he used his men to great effect, inflicting heavy losses and keeping the men's discipline until his death in Mediasch. Ludwig von Lausenay commanded the garrison of Karlsburg in the army of Transylvania. He did not partake in any of the fighting up to Mediasch, but conducted himself well during the lead up to the battle, and his fresh brigade, supplemented by the Eureka Grenadiers, was key to the continued resistance in Transylvania. Bogdan von Jablonski commanded the right brigade of the Northern Brigade Group of the army of Transylvania. He was isolated and put against a larger brigade, personally commanded by Bem. His brigade was rioted on multiple occasions, but he managed to reorganize them each time to fight effectively in the major engagements he took part in. He died a heroic death, leading the rear guard of the northern force after Torda. He is widely celebrated in Romania and is commemorated by an obelisk at the center of Torda. Karl von Urban commanded the center brigade and was in overall command of the northern brigade group of the army of Transylvania. His initiative proved vital for the effective resistance and survival of the northern brigades. He conducted himself well and proved to be a reliable commander until his death from pneumonia in early February in Hermannstadt. Coltain von Wardener commanded the left brigade of the northern brigade group of the army of Transylvania. He helped Urban decimate Rützger's force and assisted him in many of the important tactical decisions made independently from central command. He was probably the most popular commander among the Austrian ranks, and his death greatly affected his command. He is remembered today as a great general and is commemorated on many contemporary prints. Wilhelm von Mortulus took over command of von Wardener's brigade. He played an extremely important part in the lead-up to and the Battle of Velwitz, effectively commanding the brigades in Urban's absence. His conduct remained exemplary after this action. He was respected but not loved by his troops, as he was a harsh disciplinarian. He was one of the surviving brigade commanders and probably the most competent one. Wolfgang von Osterwitz took over command of von Jablonski's brigade. He operated with mixed success and often called in sick before major engagements. He died along with his men in Mediasch during the storming of the Tyne. István Orosz is an unknown and controversial figure. He acted as the second in command to von Osterwitz, which often meant commanding his brigade in major engagements due to his sickly nature. He is known to be responsible for the burning of Velwitz. During the Battle of Mediasch, he, along with an unknown officer, which no source mentions, died commanding the 41st Regiment in their final stand personally. Droschner Ferenc was entrusted by Csíkség's governing committee to defend the seat. His efforts in mobilizing his seat played a vital part in the final revolutionary victory, as his fresh troops were the ones that tipped the scales at the Battle of Mediasch.